This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
Morality. Where does it come from? Where do good and evil come from? Do they come from God? Does God exist? How did we get here? What happens when we die? Does life have meaning? And is God necessary for life to have meaning? Why is God necessary for morality? Deep questions, basic questions of human existence that philosophers had argued about for millennia. If you're a Christian, you may have some of these answers already, that God exists and morality comes from Him. But even if you're not a Christian and just an American, say, do you realize how much of your moral code of right and wrong in Western civilization comes from the Judeo-Christian ethic? It's going to be a bit of a different kind of conversation today as we dig for the truth, fundamental truth. Henry Smith is here, and also Dr. Josh Kline, an educator, teacher of world history and Western Civ, and he's an elder at Grace Gospel Church in Allentown, PA. All right, so where do you want to start with these easy questions? People don't normally sit and think about these things. Where does good and evil come from?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that everybody has a moral sense. You know, we all recognize things as being right or wrong or good and bad. And so I think because we all have this moral sense, we think that somehow we can just make it up, or it's, you know, if the majority has a certain opinion, then that's what is good or bad or right or wrong. But when you get into talking about morality, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding between the difference between moral epistemology, how do you know what's good, bad, right, or wrong, and like you were just saying, what would be moral ontology, which is the question of whether good, bad, right, or wrong actually exist. And if you're looking at that question, then, you know, the question is the one of grounding. Like, well, how do you ground this? Because if you just want to say it's up to me, that I'm the one who decides what's good, bad, right, or wrong, that would be subjective, right? It's subjective morality. But if I'm the one who decides, then that means that good, bad, right, or wrong are decidable, right? That they're not set in stone, so they can be whatever I want it to be. Well, if that's the case, then they don't really exist in the first place, right? It's not something that I'm discovering. It's something that I'm just making up out of, you know, full cloth. And if that's the case, then the obvious question is, well, then why is my view the correct view, and why is Henry's view not the correct view if we disagree? Or what if, like, the three of us all agree that this is the way things should be, and, you know, other people disagree? Or, you know, to take it all the way to the Nazis, like, what if that's the way they thought it should be in Nazi Germany? Like, who's the one who decides these things? So if you're going to say that morality exists, then realistically, it has to exist objectively, right? It can't be just my opinion or your opinion. It has to come from, like, there has to be some standard by which you're comparing things, you know, like who's a better person, Mother Teresa or Hitler? That question makes no sense unless there's some standard by which you're measuring the two of those things against. And then the question is, well, where do you get the standard from, right? Like, there has to be some transcendent, morally perfect source of that, some transcendent, morally perfect lawgiver. And then that gets you to, well, where do you get that from? And it's God, right? That's the only possible answer to that. And the other thing that's interesting is the whole concept of morality it's a supernatural concept, right? Like, we're talking about a metaphysical idea. It's not something that's made of matter or material or energy. These are ideas. But like,
they're immaterial.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's as real as my senses of the material world. We have this undisputable sense of this immaterial idea of morality. And when I talk to people about this, like, the thing that's interesting is you ask them, could you live a logically consistent life without the existence of good, bad, right, or wrong? I don't think you can, right? Because, you know, at some point you're going to insist that you've been wronged, right?
Yes.
Or you can't deny this idea that, hey, that's not fair, or, you violated my rights, or all these things. And it's like, if there is no transcendent ontological foundation for these things, then they're just made up.
They're
and I think
floating.
that's the hardest part of this whole topic to deal with people, because they're like right away like, well, who are you to tell me? Well, I'm not telling you anything, but we all know that these things do exist, and so it's the argument over what's the source of this, right?
Yeah, that's a great it's a great intro. There's so many ways we could go with this. You remind me so much of points that C.S. Lewis made. You brought up the Nazis because that's really an end game kind of argument, right? Like, the end game of there is no transcendent God, majority rules or force rules in that case, whether it was the majority or not. And that was the point that Goering made at the Nuremberg trials. What are you doing coming along here judging us with this transcendent notion of law and violation of law, crimes against humanity? We made these laws legal. This is what we made them. What right do you have to come in here and try us and all this other kind of thing, right? So right there you see that going on. But Lewis even would bring it down. He would say, he kind of put that aside and said, okay, let's just talk about something simpler. When the guy, you're getting on the bus and you get up to, fix your shoe, and he takes your seat and you get mad about it, right? The moral issue permeates every aspect of human existence. And so we talk about philosophical questions about the existence of God, the compatibility of good and evil, and, different arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument or the cosmological argument, all those different things. And they're all worthy of our conversation. But the thing I think that the everyday person is most familiar with is the moral thing, because we all live in this, we're always in this tension. You always feel any interaction you have, you go to a 4th of July picnic or you're at church, so much of the human interaction is about what happened. Hey, I was at the doctor and, they wouldn't do X, Y, and Z for me and blah, blah, blah. What is that? Well, it's a moral argument that somehow the doctor's done something wrong. And it's just one of a billion examples that you can use. So the thing that's so fascinating about the moral discussion is how much it's at the fore of human life.
Right. But I think that's why, religion and politics, they're the two things you're not supposed to talk about, the family reunion, right?
Yeah, the 4th of July.
But it's because people think like, well, your opinion's wrong, or like this is not the way that we should do things, which I think even like I kind of alluded to this before, but like, even if you think about like good and bad are value statements, right?
Yeah.
And so you could come up with a way, like there are different moral theories that get you to good and bad, right? Like, so even if you go to like Immanuel Kant and like the categorical imperative, like, which is the golden rule, like do to other people as you'd want, like his whole idea is that if there's a behavior that you would want everybody to do, then that's a good thing. And if it's something that you wouldn't want everybody to do, then that's a bad thing. Well, that's a moral epistemology, right? That tells you, okay, this is a good behavior. Or even if you go to like moral Platonism, like that these values somehow just exist out in the universe somehow or whatever. But good and bad right and wrong deals with what you ought to do, right?
Yeah.
So
how like you said earlier, the standard.
So I always give the example, like what if I get out in the car and I get in my car and I'm driving through the parking lot and like Henry walks out in front of me and I run him over, right? That's bad. That would be bad. We'd all agree that's bad. But maybe it might not be wrong because maybe my brakes didn't work, or maybe like he just ran out in front of me and I didn't see it. But if I run him over and then I throw it in reverse and back over you again, that would be wrong, right? And that's why like motive matters in a criminal case.
Yeah.
But if you get to right and wrong, then the question is, well, right and wrong, like who am I? Who or what holds me accountable? Like, and so even if I have like, or the Rawls idea of this sort of veil of ignorance, and so like if his theory of figuring out what's good and bad would be like, let's say I invite you guys over for lunch and I have a pie, and I'm slicing up the pie. How would I slice it up if I didn't know which slice I was going to get? right? So I should slice them up evenly, right? So we should all divide everything up evenly. But okay, that's great. But what if nobody's going to know, and I take 2 slices of pie and just put the pieces on a plate out, and you don't know that I took more than you guys. Like, I'm not accountable to anybody. It doesn't really matter, right?
Right.
So like when you're thinking about these things, like that's the whole idea of this transcendent moral lawgiver. Like, where does this standard come from, and to who or what am I accountable to, right?
Yeah, I mean, you used the example of something as simple as a pie. We use the C.S. Lewis example of squabbling over a seat on the bus. I mean, you can't do anything in what we do as human beings without this question being in our face. I mean, you can't watch sports on TV. With, that guy did that. That's wrong.
It's cheating.
It's not just he's cheating or he broke the rules. Oh, he tackled the guy in a wrong way as if it was deliberate. He was trying to take his knee out. That's wrong. But if he tackled him the right way, but his knee got hurt anyway, that's not wrong. Right? I mean, it's just no matter what you do, where you go, what interaction you have, this is just permeates everything that we do. And that's why it's such an important conversation. And it's right what you said before, these codes are in every aspect of our transaction. This is what in Romans 2 that Paul's talking about. The law is written in our hearts. We subscribe to certain aspects of it, but we violate it. You can live your whole life being a quote unquote good person, but you lie about certain set of things, you rationalize that, but then your neighbor does the same thing to you and you become outraged. There it is. Like somehow that law just impinges upon your existence, and you can't, no matter where you live, no matter what civilization you're in, no matter what time of history, that's there, universal, inescapable, immaterial, like you said, right? So, that's the question that I think you, in a lot of your thinking, Josh, is putting your finger on. Look, if we're just a bunch of rearranged molecules, stardust, as Neil Tyson says, right? Or Carl Sagan, the universe is all there was, and all there ever will be, right? I talk about a metaphysical statement. It has nothing to do with cosmology. How does the person who holds that view even begin to ground that? And that's always been my question. And I know that people have tried to come up with complex answers. Lewis, I keep bringing up C.S. Lewis, but he had an engagement with a scholar, the name escapes me right now. And the guy just kind of argued back at him. You're saying that we're atheists or immoral and this and that. And he's like, no. He's like, I'm saying that you can't ground your moral outrage about X, Y, or Z, or about God, right? Because that's what part of us is. Shaking our fist at God saying he's done this and he's done that, even though he doesn't exist, they're still mad at him, which is another discussion.
God doesn't exist and I hate him.
And I hate him.
Right.
What's this? I hate the man on the moon too, right? That doesn't make any sense. But before I go any further, so the point that we're bringing up here partly is, there was a theologian at Westminster Seminary who he would argue for Christian theism. Van Til, his name was Cornelius Van Til. He would say it's the impossibility of the contrary. Okay, if Christianity is not true, then give me a ground for morality in a naturalistic worldview. And so, and of course, I don't think that can be coherently fleshed out. That's part of the point that you're bringing up. So maybe, I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, like you said, going back to Romans 2, like we all have this moral sense. So therefore, we all think that somehow this makes sense to us that these things exist without examining, like, well, how is it that these things actually exist? Because if they are immaterial and we're nothing but matter, then that makes no sense right off the bat. I often think about it like this too. I use the analogy of like Peter Pan, right? So like Peter Pan, we all know what Peter Pan is. You can go watch the Peter Pan movie and go to the Disney store and buy a Peter Pan doll, whatever. But Peter Pan's not real in the sense that we're talking about. Like it exists, but it only exists because somebody created Peter Pan and made it up. And if that person was never born or never came up with the idea of Peter Pan, there would be no such thing as Peter Pan. So like Peter Pan isn't real in an ontological sense, like in the fact that like we're talking about morality is real and it's transcendent. Like if Peter Pan's creator didn't exist, there would be no Peter Pan. But like, if there is no God, then morality is just like Peter Pan. It's just made up by people. And so, like, however you want to come at it, like whether it evolved over time,
Yeah.
or if it's like a utilitarian concept, whatever the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or if it's just pure majority rule or whatever. Because like one of you said about cheating, like in China, interestingly, cheating is not seen the same way it is in the Western world. Like, so if you're in school, it's sort of like, or even I read a really interesting book. It's the book is called "The Book That Changed Your World" or "Changed the World," and it's about the influence of the Bible. But the guy that wrote it was from India. So like, he was telling a story how he went to this farm. I think they were in like the Netherlands or something like that. And the person he was with went into they had like a farm store, and they went in to get some milk. And so the guy goes in and he gets 2 jugs of milk out of the refrigerator, and then he reaches up on the shelf and pulls his box out, opens it up, it's full of money, puts his money and puts it back on the shelf. And the Indian guy was just flabbergasted. He's like, where's everybody that works here? And he's like, well, they're around, but there's nobody here. He's like, so you just help yourself? And he's like, that, like his mind was blown, because he's like, in India, like they would steal the money. Like, why would you be dumb enough to leave the money on there?
Yeah,
he was talking about the influence of the Christian worldview and how that's so embedded in the culture that stuff like that happens, and you wouldn't think like, oh, I'm stealing the money. And he goes on to talk about, and I forget if I was talking to somebody else about this, but they were saying like in certain cultures, like if you wouldn't defraud if your employer gave you a chance to defraud him and you don't defraud him, then that would be seen as wrong, because you're not taking the chance to help your family out and steal money from your employer, right? So
by enhancing your family, by stealing from your employer, so it's morally wrong not to steal,
right? Yeah, and so it's the same. It's that same concept, like where you have these differing views of things, but again, it comes back to, if you don't have a way to ground these things, then maybe like I just make them up for whatever is advantageous to me or my particular culture or whatever. But at the end of the day, like I said, I think that these things are that's like truth. It's undeniable, because you can't live a consistent life without there being such a thing. And so I think that's why it's so difficult, because like you said, there's the moral indignation as soon as something happens. Like we'll say, like, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you should be prosecuted, things need to be made right.
Yep, all the time.
But when you go to ground these things, and it reminds me, we talked earlier about Sam Harris, right? So Sam Harris tries to come at this from an atheistic perspective, and he'll try to ground objective morality in human flourishing. Like whatever promotes human flourishing, then that's good. Well, I mean, think about
who defines what that is.
Yeah, well, you open Pandora's box there, because again, not to go back to the Nazi thing, like that was the whole goal, right? From a Darwinian point of view, you're
from their own worldview perspective,
you're driving evolution forward to the point where, like the Nazis, I think, thought, and you bring Nietzsche in there, like you bring in a new ethic, a transevaluation of values, he called it, and so you're driving this whole process forward to the point where he thought, like 1,000 years from now, people would look back on them and they would say, you know what, that was unpleasant, but thank you for doing that, because you've made humanity better. Like that's Sam Harris's view. But but of course, if you put yourself in that situation, like even if you were the guard in the Nazi camp, right, and the trains are coming in, and you feel like, well, I'm doing this because it's making humanity better. If you were in the train car and it was your family, would you still feel the same way?
Yeah.
No.
Of course you wouldn't. That's terrible. And Sam Harris is not that.
Right.
He's not a National Socialist.
No.
But it's strange how someone so bright, on the one hand, let me say that about reason and intelligence, because we should qualify it. Again, I'm going to go back to Van Til from Westminster Seminary. The brilliant unbeliever is like, his reason is like a power saw that cuts the wood really well, but the setting is wrong.
Yeah.
And so that's Sam Harris. That's the new atheist. You know what I mean? They're not dumb people in one sense, but the setting on their saw is set in the wrong direction.
Right.
And so somehow he doesn't see the trajectory of his thought, whereas someone like you brought up, Nietzsche, saw the trajectory of his thought, right? That's one of the issues that you always run into when the Christian presses the person making these truth claims. You want them to press them for consistency. So human flourishing, you could go to the Marxists too, like their objective was human flourishing. Now, in National Socialism, it was an ethnic thing, get rid of the Jews and the Slavs and the Gypsies, certain classes of people. But what was the objective in their mind? As sick as it sounds, human flourishing.
Yeah, you're bringing this utopia.
You're bringing it, right? Same thing with the Marxists, the old classic Marxists, when Stalin and the Soviets took over the private property, the farms in the Ukraine, 5 million people starved to death. And somehow they reasoned themselves, it was the Marxism, the ideology, the objective was on the other side of that. That's the price that had to be paid for that. And I've read some scholars who have studied this, that they had these conversations internally.
Oh, yeah.
They had these this is what's going to, most of the people that were in the Politburo said, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And Stalin's response to them was essentially, you don't have the courage to carry out the convictions of your Marxism.
Right.
That's your problem.
And the grain exports were super high
those
years because they knew what they were doing.
And there's plenty of scholars who've talked about this. I know, this isn't directly biblical, but it is in many ways. Stephen Kotkin and Ann Applebaum lots of people have studied this. So these are very basic facts of history. But and in the archives too, they've studied this. I mean, it's in Stalin's own notes, his own personal stuff. So we know these things. So in his view, it was, we're going to carry out this moral vision from the perspective of Marxism, which was atheism, essentially, to bring about human flourishing. Now, I'm sure somebody like Sam Harris would be aghast at this comparison, like, oh, you're jumping to the Nazi Stalin argument. But that's where it always ends up.
Right.
It sounds like an easy cop-out for us to just go, oh, you just went all, genocide on us, instead of the argument about the bus like C.S. Lewis was trying to do, there's nothing wrong with that either. But that's always the trajectory of this. Human flourishing, who gets to define what that is? What is it if it's in the hand of the Politburo? Well, then the kulaks die in spades. And this is for the vision of tomorrow.
Yeah, and
right? I mean, this is. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist about it, but these are just the pure facts of history.
Right. It's funny you use the term vision because I just started reading Thomas Sowell's book about vision, and it's interesting that you think of the vision, and to me, my mind immediately goes back to the idea of the worldview, right? Because it's this all encompassing idea of the way things are and the way that things should be. And so I'm going to make it right in my view. Like, again, there's the moral sense of things. And that's why I think it's interesting. Like all of these, even political questions and things like that, they're all moral questions, because if you talk about progress, like we're progressives.
Right.
Well,
right.
Again, progressive compared to what? There's a standard that's implied, right? So you have
you're assuming there's a goal, a moral goal that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to progress towards.
Right.
And even on the other side, the so-called conservatives are trying to conserve something that they believe is morally correct, worth conserving. So we don't want to go in that direction. We want to stay in this particular place, or maybe we'll make some nuanced changes, but we want to conserve a certain set of moral principles. So it's all over the place.
We want to get better,
Yeah.
all that, like better compared to what? Like all these things.
So is that, would you say that's more like a subjective moral judgment? Like, maybe it'd be helpful, we talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but what would be the difference between something that's subjectively moral versus objectively moral? And is God necessary for one of those? Like, what would you say to that?
Well, like I would say, if morality is objective, then all morality is objective. You know what I mean? It's all objective. I don't think you could give a subjective example. I think one of the things that people argue to try to say that morality is subjective is change over time, right? They'll say, well, our morality has changed and we've progressed. And so now, slavery used to be correct and people thought slavery was normal, but now, we realize that slavery is a terrible, abhorrent evil. And so we don't hold that view anymore. So that just shows that it's not objective because it's changed. But even that, you're saying we've made moral progress in that we don't believe slavery is good anymore. But where's the standard that you're getting to compare that? Because if you take the standard away, then everything becomes relative, right? And there's nothing to compare A against B. It's just your opinion versus somebody else's, or like all the stuff we talked about before. Is it might makes right? Is it?
Well, yeah. I mean, like if you go back, what you were saying, like, okay, like, so if human flourishing is the objective, we'll just use that because that usually is the goal,
right,
of most people. Most people don't say, I want to destroy the human race. That's not usually the way it is. It's usually somebody comes around with a moral vision of some kind. It may be a new moral vision. From a Christian standpoint, it may be an abhorrent moral vision, but it's a moral vision nonetheless, right? So it still goes back to so the point of the human flourishing with slavery is, I mean, there's a gazillion examples, but if you go back to the World War II example, the National Socialists used people for slave labor. Why? Well, we have these objectives we're trying to accomplish. The war machine, we're going to conquer the East in particular, right? So that we can have more room. We want the resources of the East. We want to get rid of these people so that we can flourish. There's human flourishing that want to take place. So they enslaved large populations of young people who could work in the factories. They didn't kill them, right? In their own moral framework, this is all for a particular objective. And that is abhorrent to us as Christians and to the West. But your question, I think, Josh, is why is it generally abhorrent to the West? We know that it's ultimately because of the influence of the Christian worldview, but the West is almost an accident of history in a way, if you think of the world as not being directed by God. Like, why in the world do we have a thinking in the West that slavery is bad? When for millennia, this was the normal way. The Romans would be like, what is wrong with you people?
Yeah.
Having a conversation about slavery. This is normal.
Right.
So maybe comment on that a little bit, because I know that you've thought about this a little.
Yeah, well, that's what's interesting. If you read Mein Kampf and you read Nietzsche, like I feel like Nietzsche is the key that unlocks like Hitler's view of this sort of thing, because, and especially if you look at Nietzsche's idea that God is dead, right? So if there is, and he has the parable of the madman, where the madman comes into the market and he's saying, I seek God, and the people that were there start making fun of him because they're like, well, where did he go? Is he lost? And is he hiding? Did he emigrate? And so the madman stares them down and he tells them, like, I'll tell you where God is. He's dead and we've killed him. And then he goes on to list, here's all the consequences of killing God. And, won't we have to become gods ourselves to be worthy of this task? And then he throws his lantern down and he looks at them and he realizes that he's come too soon. He says that deeds, though done by men, still require time. And this deed that's, even though it's done by them, still requires time to be seen and heard and understood. And his point is that, these people don't believe in God, but they still live as if God exists, right?
Yes.
And so they still think that there is some meaning in their life. They still think that there is such a thing as morality. And they still think that, life makes sense, that there's some purpose or value to it. And his whole point is that
purpose is better than despair.
Yeah. And so his whole point is that, like the real, the Ubermensch, the Superman is the one who realizes that this stuff's just all made up. And he's actually, Nietzsche said that society is actually a scaffolding. He said the state is unmorality organized. And so the state is just a scaffolding by which you can control people's behavior through this morality that you've essentially like foisted upon them, right? But you really understand that this is just all a game. It's Peter Pan, right? You've just made up Never Never Land. These people think they're living in Never Never Land, but you are really the one who realizes that Never Never Land doesn't really exist. I just made it up. Right? But yeah. It's towards this end that we're trying to achieve.
So the ordinary person that's in the cog in that machine, maybe we could shift a little bit, but the connection, I'll make the connection, is, and I keep bringing up Van Til because my time at Westminster, this was another thing we said, you're either borrowing or stealing from the Christian worldview. So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, The ordinary person in that construct is living their life as if it has some purpose, which they're at the low level stealing. We talked about slavery a little bit, but this is one of the things that I think we really want to try to push on as it relates to unbelief about the moral question. It's like you don't realize that your whole moral impetus, you have no justification for this in your own thinking. You're stealing it from the Christian gospel message ultimately, which is how it's permeated itself in the West. As much as we're trying to get rid of it and destroy ourselves, it's so embedded into the DNA so far. Comment on some of that a little bit, the stealing from the worldview, because I think it's really interesting.
Right. Well, let me finish what I was going with the Hitler thing, because like Hitler talked about essentially Darwinian survival of the fittest. He called it the iron logic of nature, and he said that essentially that what was happening is that the Germans had imbibed this. He called it Jewish nonsense, and he talked about how it's in the chapter on nation and race in Mein Kampf, and he talks about how that any idea that goes against the iron logic of nature is destructive of any human progress going forward, because it's essentially the reason we're here is because of the iron logic of nature, right? It's this Darwinian survival of the fittest that's driven evolution forward. And so he said that all ideas are only in the minds of men, and certain ideas are in the minds of certain men. And especially ethical and moral ideas come from certain people. And so in this case, it was the Jews, right? And so this idea that you should be, love your neighbor as yourself and be kind to the poor and the weak and all these things that, like you said, we take for granted in our society, he recognized that these come from the Bible. This is a biblical view.
So in a way, I mean, he was always on about hating the Jewish people in terms of ethnicity and religion. But in the background of that is their ideas are biblical ideas.
And he said that if you want to get rid of the idea, you need to get rid of the people that have the ideas. Yeah. Right. So you get rid of the people, you get rid of the idea.
It's a demonic logic.
Yeah,
to
and then you're off we go. And even Darwin said that. He's like, who would let their worst animals breed? But essentially that's what we're doing, because like Hitler says in his book that, since the weaker are always predominant numerically over the best, what will happen if their breeding isn't stopped? Right? Like nature does this, he says, by subjecting them to conditions that they die or get eaten by somebody else. But we, subsidize these people and let them live and continue to reproduce. And ultimately, he said that's going to end any kind of human progress, and we're going to go backwards. And eventually, like we've reached the zenith of the human race. And so, like, I think it goes back to what you were saying, though, like that we have been so entrenched in this Judeo-Christian worldview that most people take it for granted. They don't even realize, and I think that's why people think, well, of course I have rights. Well, not on a naturalistic worldview, you don't have rights, and we'll say like, well, of course we should treat people the way we want to be treated. Well, like you said, the Romans didn't think like that. So like we take these things as like this is self-evident. Like it even says in the Declaration of Independence, it's self-evident that these things exist, but it's only self-evident on a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
It's not self-evident on a naturalistic worldview that you have rights or that you're endowed by your creator or anything like that, because those things don't exist.
Now, wouldn't you say, I just keep thinking of, we haven't talked about it yet, but the reason we have, isn't C.S. Lewis who says we have a moral compass, if I'm remembering right, but wouldn't you say that whole good and evil is imprinted on us because of the tree in the garden, the knowledge of good and evil? Like that was introduced into us, so now we have this morality, good. We know what's good and evil, or at least there's those two categories. Like it may be somewhat relative, but there's always this, oh, well, you wronged me, and oh, no, this is right. And whether that saw is in the right place, aiming in the right direction or whatever, but everybody has that duality.
There's always a dividing line, no matter how much it is. I mean, just think about the classic Italian mafia. They murder people to advance their crime syndicate, but there's moral rules within it. You don't get into drugs. Why not? why is there a moral code where you can murder people, but you don't get into the drug trade, or you don't do X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. It sounds like maybe a silly analogy, but it's like, even in there, in what appears to be amoral, it's not amoral. There's always a law code that's operating. The Germans were the same way. The Soviets were the same way. I mean, no matter how brutish you can whoever you come up with in history, no matter how depraved it is, the ideology, there's still a set of moral values that are there present. There's things that you ought to do in the context of that. I think that's part of the point you're getting at. There's an ought.
Yeah.
There's nothing that human beings can do that doesn't have an ought component to it, which is what you were driving at. We can't get away from it.
Yeah, and I think one of the most fascinating questions you can ask a group of people, which I've done it a lot, and you always get the same response, right? If you say to them, has anybody in here ever known something to be wrong, but you've done it anyway? Raise your hand. Every single person always raises their hand across the board, like anywhere you go, that is the case. And you say, like, from a kind of metaphysical point of view, that's weird, right? Why is that we have this like innate understanding that there is a difference in behaviors? They're not just like, we don't put our value on a certain, like, if I give my grandmother a hug or I punch her in the face, like, we don't just ascribe value to that randomly, right? Like we intuitively know that those two things are not the same. They're not like neutral and waiting for us to decide what they are. Like, we know that like one of those is not acceptable, right?
Yes.
And we all know that we've transgressed. Like, and so again, when you look at, like, for example, the test for truth, like I was talking about, we have the correspondence test, which says that you can't live like this without there being such a thing as good, bad, right, or wrong. You can't live consistently. But even as part of what's called the coherence test for truth, there's the experiential relevance, right? And it's relevant to our experience when the Bible says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You see that when you just ask people, like, have you done stuff that you know you shouldn't have done? And every single person says, yes, I have. On a naturalistic point of view, that's a strange thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very strange.
Because I mentioned Romans 2 before. It's amazing how often you can, and it doesn't surprise us because the Bible diagnoses the human condition and human history, right? It diagnoses it. And for the person listening who, maybe is listening, is unsure about these things, there's no way that the biblical authors could have, from a human perspective, come up with these things on their own.
Right.
You know what I mean? When Paul writes this in Romans 2 about the exact thing that we're describing, it is an insight that you can generally get from human nature, but it's universal and it's so precise. All have fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody, Romans 1, is explicit when Paul articulates this in Romans 1, that we do these things, we know that we've violated the ordinance of God, and those who do these things know they deserve death, and then approve others who also do them, right? That's a powerful indictment, but we know. So that group of people that you're talking about, where you're taking that survey, how many have done something that they know is wrong and they all raise their hand? Boom, Romans 1 and 2. There it is.
Right.
There it is. Now, whether they cognitively in their speech will acknowledge, oh yeah, because I have the knowledge of God, I'm trying to suppress it and blah, blah, blah. It's more complex, the way that we try to push this out. But when they raise their hand, it shows you you cannot push it down like the old, ball in the swimming pool.
Yeah.
It's just impossible. And it's because it's embedded in our nature as image bearers.
Right.
So, it's amazing to me, particularly Romans, although there's other places in the scriptures that deal with this. Romans 1 and 2 are just remarkable in the way that they just sort of split us open.
Yeah.
And of course, Paul provides the remedy for that.
Yeah.
It's Christ. But it really is remarkable how that works.
Yeah. And like, it reminds me of like what Francis Schaeffer said, that we live in a two-story world, right? And in the upper story, he talks about the world with God, where you have meaning and value and purpose and morality and those types of things exist. But in the lower story, the finite world without God, life is absurd, right? And he calls the floor between the two the line of despair, because
The line of despair, he calls it.
You can't live consistently in that lower story. And I was telling you before about.
Did he say it like this? The line of despair, like pit of despair.
Yeah,
That's great.
but I was telling you about. I had this class, this graduate class, and it was called Diversity and Multiculturalism or something like that, right?
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it was great. And well, it was fascinating though, because again, the whole idea of the class is that we should respect everybody and be tolerant of all these things. And
formally speaking, we would agree with
yeah,
that.
right. But I said to the professor at one time, we got into a conversation, and I was saying, like, how are you grounding all this stuff? Like you're just assuming that, you know, rights exist, that we should treat people equally. And I said, I'm not, like you said, I'm not disagreeing with you. But I have a reason. Like I have a stairway that connects me from floor 1 to floor 2. Like you're just kind of floating in midair here. You're just saying that all these things are the way they should be. I said, says who? Says you?
Treating it like it's self-evident,
Yeah.
but you got to. You're in an institution of education.
Right.
Give me a ground for it.
Right. Like,
I think that's what
why
he was
is that?
saying.
And the same guy in one of the classes was saying, he literally, and I quote him, he said, "We need to get rid of guilt. We shouldn't feel guilty about anything." I was like, wow, that's quite a statement. So in other words, I shouldn't feel guilty about anything except if I'm not being diverse enough, right? Like that.
So he's talking about certain kinds of guilt.
Yeah.
Is
So
really
in
means.
other words, I
Right.
should behave in a certain way, and that's why you're mandating that I'm taking this class.
Yes.
But at the same time, you're telling me that I shouldn't feel guilty about anything. But I'm assuming you don't mean I shouldn't feel guilty about violating the norms that you want me to have as a result of learning the stuff that you're teaching in
Yeah.
this class, right? Like that doesn't make sense. And I think that's what reminds me too of Oz Guinness has a really interesting book called Fool's Talk. And in the book, he talks about like people who live without, like in their worldview without God, like they're forced into one of two categories he talks about. So on the one side of the spectrum, he calls them, he calls it the delusion pole, right? And so you have the people who live in this situation, they're happy, but they're logically inconsistent. Like, and I think this is most of the people who never really think about any of this stuff.
Right,
You know,
right.
they don't see the inherent contradiction in their life, in the thinking of their day-to-day life. You know, it's sort of like Nietzsche was saying in his parable. They want to affirm meaning, they want to affirm values, but they don't want objective moral values. They don't want to have them come from God or that I'm accountable to God, because I can kind of do what I want, but I'm not going to say that morality doesn't exist, right? Because I don't want that world, right? But I just want a world where I can kind of make up my own reality, and really God is made in my image, or at least how I like him. He's a nice God, sort of like the grandfather that lets me do whatever I want. And as soon as somebody does something to me, he'll punish them, but he's not going to punish me, right?
Right,
It's like,
right.
So there's that side
It's
of
funny
people,
how
right?
that always works.
Yeah, there's that side. And then on the other side, he calls it the dilemma pole, where you have people who, like some philosophers, like a Bertrand Russell, who realize that if there is no God, like Bertrand Russell wrote a paper where he calls it a free man's worship. And he talks in there about like only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. That's what he says. And it's like he realizes that, you know, he talks about the heat death of the universe that's impending, and then that all the achievements of mankind are ultimately going to come to nothing. And so, and I think about this too, like I drive by a cemetery on my way home from work every day. And if you think about the people in the cemetery, like they all have their daily problems like we do, right? And all the issues that go on, but they're dead. So those problems go away. And after a couple generations, nobody even remembers who they are. Like no one's thinking about my great-great-great-great-grandfather or whatever.
Unless you're into genealogy.
Yeah, unless you're on like, what's the...
But that's rather unusual, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is. Findagrave.com.
So like that's his point though. Like all their struggles and all their worries and all that essentially amount to nothing. And he says the whole temple of man's genius will inevitably be consumed in the heat death of the universe. So ultimately, who cares? But like Bertrand Russell even said, like, I can't live like that, right? So he was constantly writing stuff about why the Vietnam War was wrong.
Wasn't he against the First World War too? He was old enough to.
Yeah, probably.
Right. He was born in the late 1800s.
Yeah, so it's
so I seem to. It's always remarkable to me how I think the atomic bomb too. He was really worried about that. You know what I mean? Like but the Vietnam War. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, but you're right.
This is usually the case with these prominent atheists. Is they bang the drum about usually these very public kind of moral issues, like a war or something like that. So continue on, because it's all the contradictions everywhere, but keep going. I'm sorry about that.
No. Well, even the famous quote from Dawkins, right? He says this in his book, River Out of Eden, which is a provocative title, right? He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. But then the same guy who says that, like, he's a moralist through and through, right? You read in his books, and all he's doing is inveighing against all the wrongs of society brought on by these deceived religious people who are corrupting the world, according to Dawkins. But who cares, right?
Yeah,
there is no such thing as morality. According, if we're just all dancing to our DNA, and even then, like you see, it's wrong on so many fronts, because if there is no supernatural, and I got into this with the professor at that class too, like, is human behavior free or determined? Like, this is an interesting question when you get into the question of homosexuality, right? Like, am I able to decide what behaviors I actually am responsible for? Am I responsible for anything? Because if I am just my brain, and like I'm just born that way, like, wasn't there a song like "Born That Way," right?
Yeah.
If I'm born that way, then I can't be held accountable for any moral decisions that I make, right? Mm-hmm. I'm just doing what I do. I'm like, dancing to my DNA, like Dawkins said. Or is human behavior free? So if we are determined, if you believe in materialistic determinacy, then you can't be a moralist, right? Because they're like, I'm just doing what I do. Like, birds migrate, I steal stuff because I'm a kleptomaniac, like whatever. I can't be held responsible for that. And that's interesting too, I think, when you talk about the medicalization of behavior, right? Everything's a disease now. Like, well, it's a disease. I couldn't help it because it wasn't my choice. But I said to this professor, we were talking about this issue, and I said, well, I'm heterosexual. I said, does that mean I can cheat on my wife? Right? Like, can I not control my behavior? Even if I have a proclivity towards a certain behavior, don't I have as a, let's see, now you get into the mind-body thing, right? But if I'm just my brain, it seems like I cannot do that, right? And it's interesting because this guy was a clinician, and he talked about, with his clients, he talked about neuroplasticity and rewiring the brain, right? So, but if you're just your brain, how can your brain rewire itself? Like, there's got to be something else happening there. Right?
That's at play in terms of it.
And so, just to top it off, though, it's like, are humans free or determined? That's question one. And then question two, is anything wrong with anything? And then we're back to the moral thing, right?
Yeah, it always goes back to
go together, right?
Yeah. I mean, you've touched on, I mean, it's important for us to, at least, even if we can't explore them fully, is to bring in these issues, because they're all interrelated, which is what we would say about the Christian worldview. It's all interconnected. The spokes on the wheel all connect together. They don't. Well, it's the same thing with a naturalistic worldview or some syncretism of that, whatever it is that a person wants to hold to. So when you're talking about Dawkins, he wants to rail against God, but the system of the world is completely materialistic. There's no good, there's no evil. Then why is God a moral monster for the conquest of Canaan, or the slaughter of the Amalekites, or whatever it is you want to talk about? You could go into that. So there's that question, right? Russell with the Vietnam War. Who cares? It's just evolutionary survival. Who's going to win this thing? The Viet Cong, or the Western powers, or the Soviets and the Chinese as a sort of puppet state? I mean, they're using the Vietnamese, right? I mean, there's all this stuff going on there. Who cares?
Right.
It's about It's about power and survival in the end. So to me, and then the question about determinism is so interesting because you think about, now there's different views in the church about this, about in terms of God's eternal decree and his providential control over whatsoever comes to pass. And there's different debates about that. But if you take something like the Westminster Confession, which is more of a stronger doctrine of God in terms of that God foresees and plans everything that comes to pass, and in that is human free will. Now, you have to define that because of the doctrine of sin and all that. But the point is, it's so interesting. So many people will rail against the idea that God controls whatsoever comes to pass, but it's because of the personal God, the triune God of Scripture, that we are imbibed with free will because he is the ultimate one who has free will.
Right.
And they want to have free will in the context of a naturalistic universe.
Right.
I've never understood how do you even, because will is also immaterial. It's volition is not a material thing, right? It's not a material. It's something that persons do.
Yeah.
Well, animals do it too, but living sentient beings exercise will. How do you get that out of a naturalistic universe? And I think what you were alluding to is you don't.
Yeah. Well, you can't.
Free will is an illusion.
Right. We can't.
Right.
Well,
Don't some of them say that? It's an illusion.
Yeah. But even reason itself requires, like, if you are nothing but your brain, right, and we're just simply matter, then what determines what happens to matter in the universe? The laws of physics and chemistry, right? Like,
yeah.
so essentially, like my sense of self, and Schaeffer called it your personality, right? So the self, the me inside of me, which is the most undeniable aspect of reality, is like that I exist, right? That I know that, I think, therefore I am. That ultimately has to be an illusion, right? Like, what's his name? One of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. He just retired not too long ago from from Tufts University. Daniel Dennett, that's his name. Dennett said that the brain is an illusion of the brain, for the brain, by the brain. What do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
Like that. So
Well, how does he know that?
Yeah. Well, is the illusion having an illusion, right? Like, how would you know, right? There has to be some non-illusion to compare it to.
Yeah,
otherwise you
yeah.
wouldn't know. But I think the interesting thing is, going back to what we're saying, if you are the result of just the physics and chemistry, then there's no way that you can get out in front of the physics and chemistry to control what you're thinking about.
To
right?
control the physics and chemistry.
Yeah. So in other words, I'm like somebody described it once. I read they talked about it like a can of soda that you shake up and it just fizzes out. Like that's just what we're doing now. But like, again, that's so undeniably false, because like, am I saying what I'm saying because my DNA is determining it, or am I listening to what you're saying and responding appropriately? And then you get into like all the other arguments, like that. What's the professor at Notre Dame, the philosopher?
You talking about Alvin Plantinga?
Plantinga, yeah. Sorry, Plantinga's arguments about like intentionality. Like, how do you explain intentionality on a materialistic worldview? You can't. Like
and that relates to will, intentionality,
like
will.
Aboutness. Like, I have an intention to go over and like he talks about, get a drink out of the fridge. Like, how does matter have an intention to go over and get a drink out of the fridge?
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So the whole thing is so ludicrous. But like, as it relates to behavior, like if you hold that view, then you have to say that there is no such thing as morality, which I think is impossible to do. Like, and so like that's where you go back to the Dawkins and Russells and all these people. Like their whole worldview is logically contradictory. It self implodes. It's what's funny is even the Enlightenment, right? It was the age of reason, but they wanted to move away from religion. So it's you're sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. Like, you can't do science without reason. You can't have reason unless you have free will. Like, unless there's a mind, like a spiritual component, non-material component, then you're just your brain, and your brain just does what it does. So how could you even evaluate evidence? You can't.
Yeah, this is very good. They're also interconnected with one another. Like all of it. The free will question that always amazes me too. In the naturalistic construct, like I don't know. I read John Frame, the Reformed theologian, in his apologetics book. He just asks a simple question: how does an impersonal structure create moral obligation?
Yeah.
That's just a one sentence question, and that's stuck with me all these years. Like, how does it do that? How does it? And you can plug in anything else. How does it produce free will? How does it produce love? How does it produce intention? How does it produce courage? How does it produce sacrifice? I mean, right? All the things that we find noble. Think about the universal nature of courage. Even we go back to the Nazi thing. What did they laud their soldiers for? Courage in battle, for their cause.
Right.
And you're what? Excoriated for what? Cowardice. There's all these different principles, immaterial principles, interconnected. And I think you should keep asking the question to the person listening. If you're a Christian listening, think about this in your conversations with people, right? Think about, how do you get there? How did you, one of the things that you say, they're very practical. How did you draw that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think 90% of the people out there haven't thought about how they got to that conclusion. The world is such a way, but it's wrong that my neighbor, lets his dog poop on my lawn.
Yeah. Well,
or a gazillion different other examples. Can you believe he lets that dog do that? Every day I got to clean this up. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's everywhere, right? But that person next door hasn't thought about, why is that wrong?
Right. And I think the importance of that is, and there's also a motive too, because like if you follow the line of argument, right? So the traditional formulation of the moral argument, right? The objective moral argument is, if God exists, then objective moral values and duties exist, right? Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists.
Right.
But see, like now all of a sudden, there's like a twist there, right? Because now if you recognize that these things are objective and that God exists, like that brings in the fourth worldview question, is destiny, right? Like, did Hitler just get away with it? Or like, is there going to be a judgment someday? And not just Hitler, because like we said, everybody, if you ask them, have you ever done anything that you knew was wrong, but you did it anyway? Everybody says yes. So then like, how does that work? And if God's real, now we have to look at, okay, what does God say about morality? And God, and then now you're down the trail. Like, has God revealed himself? And then if he has revealed himself, and we look at the authenticity of Scripture, well, now we see that all have fallen short of the glory of God, right? And so now we're like, what do we do about that?
What's the end game after you die?
Yeah.
When you said the question of destiny.
Yeah, and like Lewis said again, like if God exists, he's not our friend, right? He's a terrible. It's something we should be very much afraid of.
Yeah.
Unless he's our savior.
Yeah.
Right. So and that's really what it comes down to. Like,
you triggered about a half a dozen thoughts that I want to run off on that, but I think I have to resist the temptation.
It's probably a never-ending conversation, but what would you say to someone listening? What would be their, what should someone be thinking about for a question maybe they haven't, like, if you're wrestling with, does God exist? Does morality exist? Where do these come from? What's a good starting place?
Can I just throw out, this is from Blaise Pascal. He says that, like, he's talking about the condition of man without God, right? And he says, as I know not whence I came, so I know not whither I go. I only know that on leaving this world, I fall forever into nothingness, or into the hands of a wrathful God, without knowing to which of these two states I shall be everlastingly consigned. Such is my condition, full of weakness and uncertainty. From all this, I conclude that I ought to spend every day of my life without seeking to know my fate. And you're like, wait, what? Like, that's not the conclusion you should come to, right?
No, especially if the wrath of God is one of the viable options.
He says, I ought to spend every day of my life without seeking to know my fate. I might perhaps be able to find a solution to my doubts, but I cannot be bothered to do so. I will not take one step toward its discovery. And unfortunately, I feel like that's the state of a lot of people. Like, they don't want to think about any of this stuff because it might make them uncomfortable, or you might have to change your course a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think these things are super important because, like, the thing about whether if something's objective, it's true or it's not true, and your opinions about it don't determine whether or not it exists. Like God, either God exists or he doesn't exist. And if I just don't believe in him, that doesn't make him not exist, right?
Yeah, it's the same thing as the sun in the sky. You
Right.
just can't make it go away. Whether or not it's there, whether it's an objective fact and not just something that you assent to. I think to your question, Luke, is I want to encourage people, the Christian, to think about these things, to read the scriptures and think about why it is you believe what you believe. In the scriptures, the answers are there. I've hammered on Romans 1 pretty hard and Romans 2, but you go there and you read what Paul says. The Spirit is speaking there, telling us this is the framework to understand morality, image bearing. We violated the law of God. It's written on our hearts. That's the framework to work in. And then when you engage with people, I would say if somebody's listening who's not a Christian, try to think clearly. God has made you in his image. You're meant to think logically. See that you can't hold to the system of thought. You want to be logical.
Right.
Consider the Christian worldview. That's where this all comes together. It doesn't mean you have all the answers. All the answers lie in the mind of God himself. So the answers are all ultimately answered. But we have enough to know as limited creatures that there's coherence in all this. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the question that Pascal about the wrath of God that's resolved in Christ, right? So it's not just about an intellectual, coherent worldview, although that's what we're pursuing. It's understanding that the riches of treasures and knowledge are deposited in Christ. That means in his revelation and in the person himself. So I would say, think about these things. Think, love the Lord your God with all your mind, not just your feelings or your ethics or whatever it might be, but our whole being worshiping God, and think as we consider what we talked about today.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, like Jesus said that he would send the Holy Spirit to convict men of sin, righteousness, judgment, which is they're all moral categories, right?
Yeah.
Right? And that you get the idea that, like, even from, I'm just looking in Acts 17, and the idea that, like, we should seek God though he's not far from us, right? So the Holy Spirit's there to convict you that these things are real, right? And God wants you to know that they're real because he's provided the solution for it.
Amen.
Right, through the Lord Jesus.
Amen.
So that was a lot to take in. To be honest, I got a little lost and my brain's a bit fried. But these questions permeate history and influence your worldview, which then filters how you look at the Bible or history and interpret archaeological discoveries. So it's deep stuff. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.